And in that position, it's like it's still going to be a strong, like 90-degree single arm. I've sort of seen this exercise emerge late, where it's like the regular cable station, one arm. Some people straps on like a handle. I don't know the world. It's like if I'm doing a row like this, it's like okay, this line of pull, given that the cable will just come straight out. We're not dealing with like an arcing path of a plate loaded machine that we could be coming up or dropping down. It's just going to be this straight line. So it's like it's going to be a really effective tool. The problem a lot of people get into is they end up in this posture, right? They end up in this like chest up position. And if we think about, I literally had to make a promise to Tess last night. She flew in from Johannesburg, that I wouldn't start loudly smushing water bottles at 6 a.m. She's like, one more time, one more. She actually didn't say that, but she was like, could you give the water bottle thing a rest? I think like, if I get it and I'm half asleep, I think they get it. So if we think about like the water bottle analogy at the rib cage, it's like if I can, like how can I create a better lever here for my lats to sort of like or how can I create a better fulcrum for my lat to create torque at this area? Like this ain't it, right? This, if I'm here with a chest up, this is kind of like compressing this lower aspect. Like let's call this hinge point, I don't know, like T10 of the thoracic spine, which is like, hey, that's probably kind of right around where the diaphragm is underneath the ribs at that lateral aspect. And it'll go down as low as like T12. And then through like some of those attachments that we brushed over, like down to the lumbar spine. But all to say, it's like, if I'm in this position and I'm trying to train this row, it's like, well, yeah, 90 degrees, if we look at like length tension relationships a lot, it's like that's strong a clock, right? Like that's really where you're going to be in the mid range of the lat where it's super strong. So the likelihood that you're going to make some sort of expansive change there, it's like we're definitely using the wrong tool for that job. However, if I'm in this unilateral setup, I could have an option to be in this position extended and drive the elbow sort of down and back to try and like isolate the lat, which is likely what we're seeing, or like why that exercise is being picked. However, you could probably do a better job in like a down pump and bucket handle position and trying to transiently drive more expansion. Now, will that expansion give us these more expansive properties? No, because it's training the lat ultimately and deprioritizing the serratus because it is in this like neutral expression range of pulling. But it's like, okay, cool, but how can we manipulate the rib cage with the diaphragm to just train the lats better? Like why does it always have to be this corrective endeavor of trying to smush and unsmush a water bottle? If I'm here and I can purposely, because the difficult part is if I'm in this position, I'm going to try and find my stability and structure because that's more energy efficient. So most people, when they unilaterally row, as they pull through, they're going to have this up or an exaggerated up pump and bucket handle, and they're going to have a further decrease in that posterior expansion. But that creates a really shitty lever on the lat. So like, let's take all like the nerdy bitch breathing stuff where it's like everyone's just on all fours looking like they're when I go on these rants, I think of like 5 people. I follow them only because they make me mad, which is such a terrible thing to do. Like it should be all desserts with Nutella and dog pages. Like that should be the entire Instagram. But I follow these fucking kids because I just want to compress and expand their heads. But it's like, if in this position, like, yo, let's be strong, man. Because like if we can here, there's going to be a huge counter rotation. Like let's make this muscular rather than structural. If I'm rowing like this, there is going to need to be a counter force this way, right? Otherwise, I'm just going to pull on this thing, and if it's heavy enough, my whole torso is just going to turn, and I won't be able to move. But because it's unilateral, we can use counter force of whatever machine we're on. But if it's a singular unilateral cable row, I'm going to have to use my obliques sort of contralaterally to not allow this to happen. Because if I can't minimize that rotation, what ends up happening is my origin moves closer to my insertion in like the lengthened position of that movement. So if I'm like this, and as I pull, my chest opens up this way, it's like, well, there's no net change in length because my thoracic spine has just moved closer to my humerus as I reach. So I'm going to need my obliques to keep me here to actually be able to initiate the row. So if I already have a necessity to pull this, I'll go back to structure, pull this bucket handle down just to maintain like the alignment or orientation for the movement to be effective, it's like, well, let's just double down. Like I need to really focus on pulling this oblique or pulling this rib cage down, pulling my sternum down. Now, when I breathe in, I've constrained two of the three places where we can drive air. Now, when I breathe in, hopefully like through the nose and try and keep out of the accessory muscles of inhalation through the neck. If I breathe in and I'm consciously contracting like oblique and rectus and transverse to keep this from happening, well, now if I just take a conscious breath in, the only place for it to go is to start to take this diaphragm that would otherwise be, you couldn't really lower because it's already starting to exhibit this flattened position from being in those ribs up. Now that I pull my ribs down, as I inhale, I can begin to flatten like this lower aspect of the begin to expand this lower aspect of the rib cage, which will then create that fulcrum for me to actually stay loaded into my lats throughout the entire range. Because most people can start here. This is easy, but can you keep your torso and your rib cage in this position as you finish? Most people are like, okay, if you're trying to row just for no reason and just like unspecified, which is like, hey, cool, do that. Like people get all crazy about like machines, especially with the back. Like some of the elaborate setups I see for back training, like sometimes it's okay to just train your back with like we're going to sprinkle in a little bit of fucking rhomboids. And it's like, this machine it's like, that's cool. It's stuff that expends calories and like requires some energy. Like you don't got to be spending 20 minutes like grabbing an incline chair and then putting 17 plates on it and then grabbing some handle configuration, having your buddy hold you in this. That's probably a lesser adaptation made than just like, okay, I'm going to do a back exercise. But let's go down the rabbit hole. So to say like, okay, 90-degree row from a compression expansion standpoint, as far as any sort of corrective measure, too much potential for load, right? And that potential for load will ultimately lead to more compressive quality. Like we look at the arm position, if we look at a little bit deeper into the length tension relationship of like the primary muscle we're trying to train, but there's still like a meat-headed benefit to understanding some of the breathing stuff where it's like, okay, I'm going to tuck this rib down. I'm going to try and stay, somewhat of like at least a neutral rib cage position or torso lean. And I'm going to use my breath to try and expand posteriorly because I've, functionally kind of closed this pump and bucket handle, which otherwise in this unilateral setup would probably want to pull upwards. And as I pull upwards, I'm going to create a lesser lever for that lat to work around the rib cage. So I'm going to be here and try and keep this the entire time, right? So that's, I guess, like that's kind of the long and short of it. The way I would look at it is like, hey, with that particular exercise, with that particular range of the shoulder, let's maybe not stand on ceremony and like start to look at it through this particular lens. But again, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's some benefit to just maintaining a better position of leverage by using breathing. Anytime we deal with any muscle at the rib cage, whether it's the pecs, whether it's the lats, whether it's the rhomboids, whatever, like there's always a consideration that you can be made on like both sides of the coin, where it's like, okay, yeah, we can, on one side of the coin, we can look at like the rehabby corrective exercise, low intensity, higher volume, pre-post accessory movement. But on the other side of the coin, we can also look, okay, it's still rib cage mechanics, or a bunch of muscles attach onto the rib cage, right? And that coin with both sides, that coin is just training, because it's all just training. Right. So that's my long answer to a short question. Backs, off the backboard. What do you got?
Yeah, I think the most important soundbite of the last 15 minutes was in the setup, we can do these things, right? So as soon as load starts being moved and muscles start doing muscle things, like we're lifting a heavy load, it is compressive. But if we get into a position with these concepts in the setup, we can maintain that position and hopefully put more tension across fibers, right? We talked about the back setup, right? Rhomboids, lats, etc. I'm the opposite human of my sternum points down at my junk. I have the downest pump handle of all time, right? So I'm in a low reach before I do dumbbell press. I breathe into my back. I use that air in my back to lean back to expand my chest. Now my pump handle is up to the point where I can actually stretch my chest and get some sort of contraction across my pecs, right? But that all of that happens in the setup before I lean back onto the bench. If I just lean back on the bench and try to do that, I have some heavy dumbbells in my hand, hopefully, and that doesn't happen. So all this stuff works in the setup unless we're trying to open up more range of motion, go
So
from
shallow,
more
it'd almost be
corrective length.
similar to the, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
It would almost be similar to the Z press you were talking about, where you would start out really in lateral flexion and really be pushing at first, driving the air into the other side of the rib like you were talking last week, like you were pressing a kettlebell. So you're getting that lateral flexion of your spine. You kind of be grabbing the chair on one side to pull.
Yeah, so like I guess like let's designate planes of movement to each one of these processes, right? Like in Baxter's example, he was using driving air to ultimately have a better leverage point for the pecs to move through the sagittal plane. Similar
Mm-hmm.
to with the row, where it's like, yeah, I'm setting up in this way so that I can drive air to better movement through the sagittal plane. The only thing I would say that's different with the Z press is we're trying to manipulate transient, like compression on one side, expansion on the other through like the more frontal and some
Okay.
transverse plane. Right now, but the exercises are going to sort of necessitate, because of the position of the arm, a slightly different conversation, right? The Z press is probably a way better tool on the corrective accessory side of things, right? Like if anyone comes in and be like, "Hey man, what do you Z press?" You'd be like, "We're Z pressing to be able to bench press more, right? We're Z pressing to pull that car back and create some an ability to create torque in a rib cage that probably has really biased to A to P compression, which we're now trying to give it some like lateral compressive properties to be able to then move forward and keep compressing A to P and move through the sagittal plane, right? So like, that would be my one caveat, is like the Z press is going to be a way better tool in the arena of like corrective accessory because of the position of the arm being in this like high exposure range. I'm just going to
Okay.
have to use way more oblique, and I'm going to have to use way more serratus in this high shoulder position,
Mm-hmm.
which in order to access for me, I'm going to have to try to access early rotation through the frontal plane. And then over time, as I can exhibit these properties, and I can just get my arm over my head with less sort of compensation through the frontal plane and have more movement sort of systemically through the transverse plane, then it's like, okay, I could probably potentially see a carryover to an ability to increase, training volume at the very least, I would say. Like I could probably bench press more if I built this buffer of function at my shoulder from the rib cage that would allow me to Z press without looking like a spastic, right?
Okay.
But if I just keep benching and I don't do that, and I keep, rather than doing, and this is where Bax, I think, made a really good point in the last couple of weeks, is like putting this into perspective from a training standpoint. It's like our A1s are always going to be expressions, but we can only express ultimately what we're exposed to from a function perspective. Like, the bench press isn't a good way to build shoulder function. It's a way to express it. So it's like, yeah, cool, express it first, but then how much you can express ultimately will be how much you have to then dose your bouts of exposure to. So for someone like me, A1, A2 or sorry, A1 is probably going to be, yes, something in incline, flat, or decline. And it's going to be my greatest potential for lifting heavy. But because I've just done it a lot and stupidly for a long time, it's like my B1 should probably be at more points than not in my like quote unquote off season, extended off season. In competing in powerlifting, it's like my B1 could be a Z press, or my B1 could be like a higher reach or a lower reach in these exposure ranges. Where George, I want you to flat bench, and then I want you to close grip bench, and then I want you to dumbbell bench, and I want you to do that for until you're 17, which is 5 years. And then we'll talk about maybe making the C exercise something that's more in the exposure range. But yes, similar to answer your question, yeah, similar idea of the Z press, but understanding that like in both Max and I's example, sagittal plane expression of function, Z press, high reach exposure range, probably going to be a better tool for that sort of corrective accessory slot. And then just where you put it is depending on, who needs that, if that makes sense.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah. And that should be clear in 12 hours. Because we're gonna break down like exercise, like kind of a grid of what could potentially occur as a byproduct of like where we put the arm, what range we're in, what kind of load, direction of load, whether push or pull, what kind of like machine or apparatus modality we're using. So yeah, hopefully that'll be clear later, but I like that your head's kind of thinking this way.
I have a question. In terms of something like a bilateral, like a chin up, would you categorize that as more of like an exposure based movement because you're starting in those high exposure ranges, or would you consider that like an expression based movement because you're moving through that expression range?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And Bax and I have talked about this when we revamped the slides. So how many of you know Killian Hamilton? Kind of like nihilistic dude, looks a little bit like me, pretends like he doesn't care about anything, but actually is like a stupid bleeding heart, but does this thing where like he doesn't smile on Instagram and he tries to be like, and he does his annoying Q&As where he like just sits there and tries to look as unimpressed as possible. But what he's really unimpressed with is himself. That
He
guy.
went through
He
went through a 5-minute what he does for pre-workout this morning.
Yeah, it's not healthy. Whatever it is, I didn't see it, but I know him, and it's not healthy. But all his crazy nihilistic tendencies aside, his pull-ups are really interesting, and they're interesting in the sense that they're quote unquote good, because how like make the comparison to a pull-up to an overhead barbell press, right? There's like an inherent J-shaped kind of arc to the shoulder flexion, because in the case of a barbell press, we have to navigate this bar around our dome. With a pull-up, we don't necessarily have to do that. I mean, we kind of do. We tuck the chin and like, all to say, a pull-up should be much like more categorized in the expression range, because it has to, if we're creating like, I hate to use the word, so fuck it, I'm just not going to use it. If we're creating good leverage at the rib cage, we can't be compressed, right? And this will be something that I like where the questions are going, because they're going right into tonight's lecture, so this will complement quite well. If we're doing a pull-up and we want to use our lats at some point in the pull-up, if we are like compressed together and our shoulder blades are retracted and our like pump handle and our bucket handle are up, it's like we're again, just like the row analogy here, where we're like compressed in the back as we kind of keep our chest proud. So we've decreased the lever for the lats to do work. So a pull-up actually it should require you to like displace your center of mass posteriorly as you kind of go through this extension arc. The difficult part is when we see that breakdown, we're likely seeing people sort of trying to quickly default into their expression ranges. Because if I'm here and then I can't, displace my center of mass posteriorly, which is like almost like hollowing in this overhead position, and I begin to raise the sternum, I'm really just trying to, like find a path of least resistance that's not in the lat, right? I'm really just trying to create as much compression to find internal rotation quicker so that I can sort of propel myself through this arc. So with what Killian can do really well is that it is really, like, if you just look at its humerus, it is really just the expression of this arc, where most people's pull-ups, if they're more quote unquote like compressed and they're trying to find that exposure range quicker by moving their sternum up and decreasing the amount of shoulder flexion at an earlier part of the range, it's like they're just trying to get into that compressive property faster because they don't have this more they don't have this built up tolerance to this exposure range, because all that does is gets them out of the exposure range quicker. Facts, thoughts?
Yeah, so a pull-up should be in the exposure range, or an expansive slash something that will continue to allow you to have access to that range. But for probably 99% of people, it is a very compressive thing because we're in so much extension. And especially like someone learning to get their first pull-up, a lot of people will put them on like the assisted pull-up machine where there's no bar where your head goes. And then where's your center of mass? It's forward because your feet are on the assistance pad. And then you're doing like an extended compressed Terry's pull-up, right? Like we're not, and then our pull-up looks like that on the bar. So it should be like Killian can do pull-ups every single day. He does or did, right? And it continues to give him access to those ranges because he's expressing his function there, right? But someone who arches could do pull-ups every day, and it's just going to make them worse at moving, right? It's just going to continue to compress them. So pull-up is a slippery slope. Like it's ridiculously hard to do it in a way that you are getting, that you can continue to do it forever, right? But if you look at like anyone who's good at pulling themselves over a bar, right? Like when we talk about a pull-up, we're not really talking about like specific muscles. We're talking about like a little bit more of a skill, right? So like anyone who can like do a bar muscle up, or like those bar stars guys who like work out in the park, right? Like those people can shift their center of mass back, just make a lever to do like a lat pull down / row with their own body, right? That's really what they're doing. They're not pulling straight down. They're just making a lever. The same thing as like an overhead press. I'm just pushing this out to make a lever for my anterior musculature to push the bar over my head. And then when it's here, I'm not pushing the bar backwards. I'm just bringing my body through it, right? So it's a little bit more of a skill-based thing, but it should be an expansive thing, but it's not for most people.
It's such a high relative intensity that it's expansive until it's really not, right? Like, because it's all relative to body weight too, which is like, imagine in a set of squats being able to like calibrate load and position very quickly, and like starting your set of squats by doing some like heels elevated, like a med ball Zerchery type number. And then as technique breaks down, you're able to compensate by reverting to a low bar back squat. It's like that is the similar shift, which makes it like a very unique skill, because it's like if your body's trying to complete the task and you fatigue in places that are necessary to maintain like the relative orientation of the humerus to the rib cage and that like posterior displacement of the center of mass, and you can no longer do that anymore, or at least in like a meaningful way that allow you to complete the task, you're just going to take this high load, and then you're going to shift it to a very compressive technique to start to more efficiently apply the force that you have. So it's just like, it's literally, it's the equivalent of going like med ball, Zercher, low reach, heels elevated, nerdy shit, to like, oh, I'm tired, 405 low bar back squat. So you have this very like, very quote unquote expansive setup that you can do for a bit. But imagine flipping a switch and just going from here to this. It's literally the same thing. I'm like, I could do, well, I probably do one, but like Killian can do these prison pull-ups, and he really only stops doing them, or he stops doing them while they're still prison pull-ups. He doesn't go prison pull-up, prison pull-up, prison pull-up, then Good Life Fitness pull-up, right? Commercial gym pull-up. He stops, so it's always that. And because it's always that, it'll always be that. Because he's not teaching himself that like opt out. He's not giving himself that opt out option to like, hey, when this breaks down, move to this compressive position to just more efficiently apply the force that you have left to apply. He goes, no, all right, that's over. Technical failure and quote unquote muscular failure, whatever. It definitely always stops at technical failure. Because with his upper back, it's like he could probably sort out how to do a few more reps, but it would minimize the likelihood over time that would compound in his ability to probably do pull-ups every day.
I think also just anecdotally, still in the pull-up thing, we're talking about like leveraging lats. I think starting, if you're trying to teach yourself how to do a pull-up, like just using lats the way Killian does with that kind of like arcing motion, starting with like a close neutral grip is going to be so much easier for that. I mean, I know it is for me, than like going wide grip. Cause like what you were just saying is like, or sorry, what Bax was saying about like the Terry's pull up, like that's everyone who does like a wide grip, like lat pull down, right? Is like, everyone knows you're not using your lats, but like if you jump up on a pull up bar and come out here, it's the same thing. Like Killian can do it because he's great at it. But like, if it's your first shot doing this, find a pull up bar with like the close grip neutral things, try to set it up the same way you would set up like an iliac lat pull down. Like you're going to retract the rib cage, you're going to grip slightly out in front of you, and your elbow is going to come down in that kind of arcing path. Like, yeah, just try and set up, like think of the cueing, the setup you would use for a single arm lat pull down, and just make as much of that as you can into the pull up.
How open question to anyone, because it's been a while. What would be a progression or preferred progression in grip? Because I like that you went with neutral, but it kind of brought up, I think it was like a Poliquin thing, probably.
Yeah,
if I'm talking about it, it's probably a Poliquin thing.
He goes neutral, supinated, pronated.
Which is interesting because I would think that supinated for most people would be
strongest.
Easy. I don't know, like, because that's really, Harlan, where my question lies, is like, if we're all to sit and write a program for and people do this, and I'm really curious, and I might buy one of them just to see, programming around someone getting their first body weight, like prison pull up, like not, just some crazy compensation nightmare of a pull-up. What would be the progression of grip? What would be like some accessory exercises? Like I'm interested in your guys' take on. I
find a lot of people are weakest like right at the top. I think that going with the neutral grip, like everyone's stronger in a hammer curl. So if I think you'd be using that same muscles more with a neutral grip. And people are pretty weak at it. All my clients would always fail kind of in the top quarter. So I don't know if that would be why, but.
Okay, so you like the idea of going neutral supinated. RIP Poliquin, pour out your Anadrol for the homie. Peter, do you have an unmute button? I didn't come here to read. Get the fuck out of here with this reading nonsense. No.
I found that most people I do corporate guys, so guys that are just basically very weak and sit in a chair all day. Lots of money, yep. But a lot of them, when they do it, they always found that supinated grip pull up is probably the easiest for them. I've just seen it always more anecdotally that way. Even though neutral grip, I've found some other stronger guys make it more comfortable to get in that overhead position. Whether they're not getting all the way down because they just kind of like cheating it just a little bit. But I noticed that in terms of their confidence, they're like, yep, got my first pull up in a way all the way to the top with the supinated grip.
Yeah, I think, and Bax, I want your opinion on this, because my thought would be, as we supinate, we have to express that extra rotation. And even just doing this in my chair, I'm creating a lesser degree of shoulder flexion. So does the supination really just, is it a mechanical advantage for the lat over the teres, and just completely eliminating the teres involvement by maintaining this forced static external rotation of the shoulder? Or is it the fact that as you supinate, you're likely not going to be in the same dead hang, structurally unstable position to necessitate this sweeping arc as the center of mass moves posteriorly? Like, are you just able to capture some of that compression earlier because you're starting in likely a more forced posterior displacement and a lesser degree of shoulder flexion through that arc? Thoughts?
How much is your bicep helping you with that too, Shallow, when you have the supinated grip?
Yeah. Okay, so I think if I've read this properly, I think bicep as an accessory